I've pretty much run out of ways to introduce these videos, so let's go ahead and jump into the 7th and 8th episodes of what's shaping up to be one of the most impressive animated seasons of television of all time.
Beans! Oh no.
Just like all 6 of the first episodes, this one starts with a seemingly unrelated cold open, as we see a young Marcy traverse through a familiarly apocalyptic ooh, as the audience expects to see Simon appear walking behind her. This scene benefits from the fact that we did see a Marcy and Simon flashback earlier in Fionna and Cake, which made me immediately curious about why we would need to be getting another one. A line of thought ended by the reveal of Simon's corpse, followed by Marcy being approached by a different figure as we cut to the present. The reveal at the end of this scene hits like a truck, and I really like that, unlike every other universe, including the next one, we go into this world knowing the twist, as we are set up to see what Simon's influence truly saved Marceline from. Going into this universe, Fiona's concerns, along with something else that we'll get to in a second, come with her from Baby World, as she continues to fear that all she's done is hurt people and make things worse. Something that is somewhat backed up by what happened to Farm World Finn and the Winter King because of her, although the latter was definitely deserved. Anyway, I'll talk more about this as we go through this pair of episodes, but I really love how they finally give Fionna a true bona fide arc with this pair, as she's the best as a character that she's ever been. The world of this episode, even before we meet any of the other characters, is really interesting from the jump, as the gothic apocalyptic vibe of this vampiric ooh is just such a fun place for an episode. After a great scene fighting the vampires of this world as Cake showcases a grasp of her powers, we get introduced to the rebels of this world with versions of PB, Huntress Wizard, and most surprisingly of all, Martin. To start with him, I love how they utilize his character throughout this one. Ever since Islands, the show has pushed the idea that Martin's jerkiness was a result of his circumstances, and watching him be genuinely a good person up until the very end of this one only makes you feel bad for every version of this character that we've ever seen. The best example of this comes when he feeds baby Finn, as it's just absolutely gut-wrenching to watch the two interact with the knowledge of their past back in RU, and it definitely made me think that Martin was going to get to raise Finn at the end of this episode, something that obviously doesn't get to happen. Also, I kinda breezed past it, but baby Finn's inclusion after tagging along from Baby World is pretty minimal in this one besides a few jokes. And given how this one ends, I can't imagine things going very well for him moving forward. Anyway, Huntress Wizard, who's just become Huntress in this one, definitely doesn't have as interesting of a character beat as Martin, although the character herself is just so cool that it's neat having her around, and she does participate in this great moment at the very end that we'll get to in a second. And obviously, the main attraction of this rebel group is Bonnibel, who's become the war general that everybody treats her as in the main series, as she coldly leads the group towards defeating the vampires. This is another really interesting interpretation of the character after the Candy Queen, and her interactions with Marceline are fantastic later in the episode. We'll get back to this world in a bit, but first we gotta talk about all the other stuff going on in this episode, starting with the short scene of Scarab and Prismo, where Scarab is more or less taken out of being the antagonist for at least these 2 episodes. And while it is somewhat entertaining to listen to him and Prismo squabble, Scarab continues to be the only real problem I have with this season, as he is continuously made to be a smaller and smaller part of each episode. Anyway, more on that in the next episode, but moving on to something more positive, this one also has a Marshall and Gary plot just like the Winter King, and while it's not narratively as strong as that one, I still like it quite a bit. Seeing a bunch of characters from throughout the show's history is a fun touch for the gala, and the relationship between Marshall and his mother is handled really well. Where the plotline loses me a little bit is in its resolution, as Gary pretty much gives up his dreams of finding an investor just so Marshall isn't embarrassed by his mother for a night in front of everybody. Still, Gary and Marshall are just such likable characters that this plot has no choice but to be enjoyable, and the parallels between them and the Marcy and Bubblegum that we're watching are handled really well in the conclusion of this episode to create a fantastically artistic finale, but we'll get back to that in a second. First though, back to our rebel gang, as Fionna forces the tank to stop in order to help what appear to be stranded humans, only for the trap to quickly reveal itself. This scene is tremendously great for a variety of reasons, as besides just having some great fight choreography, we also get the introduction of the Marceline of this world, who's pretty much become the vampire princess in a cruel twist of fate, and is just such a fun character. Every voice line and piece of animation makes her better and better, and the way that she just brutally dispatches Martin makes for such an impactful scene. The over-the-top nature of her and Bubblegum during this scene is great too, but the real importance lies in what this does to Fiona's psyche, as she has the clearest example yet of her actions directly harming somebody, as she is directly responsible for the death of Martin, the guilt for which being symbolized by her carrying his jacket. Meanwhile, Cake becomes a literal tank for the gang as she continues to try and use her powers for good, as her and Fiona's parallel arcs continue to become quite apparent. Moving into the final attack, as everybody is setting up the garlic bombs for the surprisingly cleverly written plan, we get another look at this Marceline as she changes into a different outfit, clearly showing the fact that the crew loved designing this version of the character so much that they couldn't constrict themselves to one design. And yeah, the amount of love and care that went into this version of the character is surely being appreciated, as just like the Candy Queen last week, there is definitely a good amount of Princess Marcy fan art. Unfortunately, Simon is not as receptive to this version of the character as the audience, as he ponders how his little Marceline could become this monster, as Fionna points out that his absence could be the reason for all of this. While I get that actually confirming this reality to Simon would have likely been a little bit clunky, I do wish that Simon could have confronted this idea a bit more than just saying, oh yeah, maybe that is the case. But Simon at least considering that his presence could have been what partially saved Ooh from vampiric hell is a nice moment. All of this sets up the climax of the episode, as Huntress goes down to knock off the crown and allow daylight in as the garlic bombs go off, only for the atmosphere to remain cloudy, as the Vampire King comes out with the surprisingly jacked up corpse of HW. This scene is unimaginably sick, as it's just such a shock to see her covered in arrows as it all becomes hopeless. Speaking of the Vampire King, this is probably his best episode that we've ever gotten, as unlike his appearance towards the tail end of Stakes, he remains this imposing figure throughout the entire episode. Even when Cake is trying to take the crown, he immediately switches back from goofy dad mode to horrifying leader of the vamps, as Fionna and Simon are forced to warp for the final time in order to save Cake, albeit against her will. As Fionna can't prevent herself from trying to protect Cake, the ramifications of which coming in the next episode. Before then though, for the first time in the series, the episode hangs on a bit in the last universe to give us the Bubblegum and Marcy scene that we all want, and yeah, it's just as sick as you ever could have hoped for. The romantic tension as they try to somewhat kill each other is so palpably fun to watch. And the pair presumably tumbling to their collective deaths at the end is a great way to leave this universe, as it continues its parallels with what's going on in Fionna World. Everything about this fight, from the animation to the music to the voice acting, is just sublime, and is a fantastic send-off to these versions of the characters. In general, The Star is just another fantastic episode of the show, with different versions of Marcy and PB making up each half of the episode, while Fionna and Cake begin to have some tension that permeates throughout the following half of this pair. While not quite the strongest outing of the series yet, as some of the A-plot, B-plot parallels end up being a little bit clunky, this episode just has too many fun scenes, too many terrific designs, and too much great writing to be classified as anything other than fantastic.
Everything bagel, right where I left it.
Despite its somewhat goofy name, Jerry doesn't even spend a second hiding its intentions to rip out your heartstrings as we open to a Simon and Betty flashback. This episode splits its story into little pieces that we'll get throughout, so I'm going to talk about each one as we get to it, but from the beginning, these flashbacks are heartbreakingly beautiful. While each one is better than the last, even the very first time we see the pair as Simon takes a tumble shows both the fantastic art style these scenes take from the rosy lens of a nostalgic Simon, and the immense chemistry of this pair, as the episode somehow ups the devastation of their relationship more and more every time we see them. Before getting to Fionna and Cake's adventures in this one, let's quickly go through the Scarab's plot so we're at least only going back and forth between two different stories, as Scarab doesn't exactly get a ton of screen time. Just like all of his other appearances in the show, it's a bit of a mixed bag. To start, the visuals throughout these scenes are fantastically surreal, with character designs like Orbo making these scenes stand out visually from both of the other plots. Unfortunately, everything else about these plots seem like a drag, almost intentionally being boring to add some tension to the other two stories, which, while it does serve that purpose, I still fail to connect with Scarab or really care about what he's getting up to. Luckily though, his scenes only take up a few minutes, and the rest of the episode is still so terrific that it's able to fight with Destiny and Simon Petrikov for being the best in the season so far. But let's finally get into the events of what I'll call Desert World for now, as our trio end up adventuring through what first appears to be a wasteland. Throughout this one, Cake takes her place as opposition to Fionna, as she's clearly frustrated with her for ruining what she perceived was her chance to actually grab the crown. And while she is bordering on the line of just kind of being annoying throughout this one and her angst towards Fionna, it makes sense that she would be frustrated as they enter world number 4, and the amount that this weighs on Fionna provides some really interesting character moments with her throughout this one. The campfire scene towards the front of this one pretty clearly stands parallel to the one back in Simon Petrikov, with Simon being the one who is doing the cheering up this time, finding Fiona's love for love and telling her about him and Betty. The first of the flashbacks at this point starts up with Simon giving a presentation about various artifacts that the audience knows are real, as he is ridiculed by everybody for believing in such things. Everybody except for Betty. Betty first falling in love with Simon's work before the person fits their relationship dynamic so well, and as I will likely repeat myself when talking about these scenes later on, every single flashback is just so sweetly written that it hurts your soul watching them and knowing what happens to this pair shortly after. Before getting back to them though, the trio take a trip to meet our favorite robot, as BMO delivers this line that I haven't seen much discussion of, but hit me pretty hard when I first watched the episode.
They're around, except for football. I haven't seen her in forever.
Throughout the show, football has represented the power of BMO's imagination, and in this world devoid of life, it's just devastating to hear that he can't even conjure up the will to talk to football. In general though, BMO is just legendarily good throughout this one, as he both delivers hilarious line after hilarious line, while also being a fascinating way to convey the story of this world, as his somewhat manic ramblings ramblings slowly reveal the truth. Before then, though, on our way to see what's left of the Ice Kingdom, we get another fantastic flashback with Betty, as we see a bit more of why her and Simon work so well as a pair, as his cautious approach to finding snakes is met by Betty's, as Fionna puts it, badass method of sprinting across the rocks. I love Simon's smile after Fiona's comment too, as focusing on the good times with Betty does him a lot more good than being sad about her current state. Flipping back to the desert world, and I do apologize for the back and forth nature of this part of the video, watching Ice King's tapes both provide some levity as we get to see this version of the character once again, while also finally giving Fionna some knowledge about why Simon's plan to use the crown feels a bit devastating to any informed viewer, as she fails to mention the reveal of the crown's location in the video, not even going to look for it herself, at least on screen that is. Seeing Betty refuse to impose on Simon's moment of gratification as his theories are finally proven true is such a bittersweet moment, as she loves him so much that she can't make herself do anything that might possibly harm the culmination of his career. I also love that Simon is unable to speak clearly in front of her, as he's too smitten to even think properly. Back at the Candy Kingdom, as Bimo continues to entertain his audience, his mania stops being charming to Cake as she flips out, overwhelming Fionna as she's forced to run out to the balcony to sob. This is definitely a low point for Cake throughout the series, as even watching her best friend run out crying doesn't even faze her enough to go out and check on Fionna, as Simon ends up being the one to have to cheer her up, as we get the second to last and the longest of the flashbacks, as Simon finds Betty's note and sprints to stop her at the bus station. This scene is just out of this world in how great it is at making the pair appear as soulmates, which of course all ends to just how devastated each one of them was when the other was taken. The rom-com nature of Simon finding her note in the library adds to the overall unhateably gushy nature of this thing, and of course, just like every other scene throughout this season, the show's animation continues to just be terrific, with some of these shots just being too stinkin' impressive to describe with words. Seriously, I'm struggling to find other things to write about this scene, as watching Simon awkwardly profess his love to Betty as she joyfully accepts just makes for one of the most romantic moments I've ever seen animated, and we're somehow not even to the best part yet. Before then though, Bimo dies. It's such a shock, no pun intended, to watch Bimo bring up this plan to use his heart to power the remote, only for it to overload his circuits and leave our trio speechless. And it hits even harder a second time during Simon's eulogy, in which it's revealed that it didn't even work. Even in a world where everybody is dead, except for Neptr, who's probably just busy somewhere. Watching Bimo, the show's stand-in for youthful innocence and joy, lose his life for literally nothing just sets the depressing vibe for the last few minutes of the episode. And while I've praised Fionna and Cake for over an hour this month, the final two scenes of this episode are back-to-back some of the best scenes that Adventure Time has ever done. The first of which being the final scene of Simon and Betty at the bus stop, as their song, which is Everything in You, written and sung by Half Shy, plays in the background. It's only about 40 seconds, but that hasn't stopped me from watching it over and over and over again. Every single frame as the fireflies surround a content Betty and Simon is perfectly animated, and Half Shy's vocals are just mind-numbingly heavenly, as the lyrics describe the beautifully but ultimately doomed romance between the pair. It's such a stunningly great ending to their story throughout the episode, and is my highlight of these first 8 episodes, and is honestly just one of my favorite scenes of anything ever. I mean, I just don't know how else to describe it other than utterly fantastic, as it further recontextualizes their relationship throughout the series and the drastic measures both of them took to see the other. After this moment though, we finally get to meet the title character of the episode, with Jerry ending up being a nickname for none other than the Lich. And I'm not sure any twist in Adventure Time has ever hit me quite as hard as the reveal of this being the world where the Lich succeeded. Everything in this episode, like the Ice King turning into a skeleton at the end of his tape, all suddenly comes into place with this reveal. And before your mind can even process it, we get the iconic static as Ron Perl's voice creeps in as he drags our trio across an empty void. While we've gotten a bunch of Lich returns at this point, I don't really think I'll ever get tired of him popping into these stories, with this episode giving us another interpretation of the character as he lets our trio live. Just like everybody else in the story, after achieving his one and only goal, the Lich is without purpose too, as he simply goes back into apparent hibernation. At this point, Fionna gives us the second big twist of the episode, as she reveals that she went back and nabbed the crown from the Ice Kingdom. While they don't mention it in this episode, I think part of the reason that Cake is immediately so viscerally upset by this betrayal is because if Fionna had just told everybody that she had it, then BMO never would have had to die, as even in her attempts to stop hurting people, Fionna still causes pain. At this point, Simon breaks up their kerfuffle, as after reflecting on his past with Betty, he's ready to help bring magic back into their world as he starts up the ritual, using his sane mind to glance at a photo of his fiancée one last time, as the title pair jump back into the portal. At this point, Scarab suddenly shows up, just in time for Simon putting on the crown to be interrupted by a second portal forming underneath him, which mysteriously takes him and Scarab while Golb imagery fills the room, as it becomes pretty apparent who summoned Simon. This scene feels so climatic, both in the fact that it's the fulfillment of the plotline that was set up back in episode 4, as well as having the emotional fulfillment of Simon trying to put back on the crown, only to presumably be saved by the person he just spent the entire episode thinking about. I'm going to talk more about this episode at some point later down the line, as it is truly one of the most spectacular pieces of animation I've ever had the honor of watching. But for now, despite the goofy name, Jerry is filled with so many fantastic moments along both plots that it makes it feel almost impossibly fantastic, as Fionna and Cake continues to blow me away heading into its final set of episodes. So yeah, just like every week of this show, I was genuinely stunned by Fionna and Cake this time around. And with the finale being only days away, I'm both sad that this era of Adventure Time revival throughout the fandom is coming to a close, as well as being immensely excited for how the story is gonna wrap up. And scared. Mostly scared. This has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you in about a week to discuss whatever masterpiece the crew has cooked up for us. Thanks for watching.